Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled The UN Celebrates 75, What Does the Future Hold? Celebrating UN Day 2020, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations here in Minnesota. I am Nancy Dunleavy, current president of the Minnesota chapter of Citizens for Global Solutions. Along with the United Nations Association, Harold E. Stassen Minnesota chapter, and Global Minnesota, we are very pleased to co-host this event. We are fortunate to have with us today Stéphane Dujarric, spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres. Many of you joined us last year on October 23rd, when Mr. Dujarric was our guest speaker for a UN Day 75th anniversary kickoff event that we hosted at the James J. Hill House in St. Paul. One of the highlights of Mr. Dujarric's trip to Minnesota last year was a visit to Highland Park Senior High School in St. Paul, where he met with Model UN and AP Social Studies students. During the Q&A session, Mr. Dujarric shared that to be prepared for the many varied questions that he receives daily during his press briefings, he has 3 ring binders with tabs for each of the 193 member states that are members of the UN. This one small detail gives us an insight into the challenges of his job. Imagine the role of representing the UN Secretary General's voice at this time in our history, as our world faces growing challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, economic and social inequalities, new forms of violence, and rapid changes in technology. At the same time that public trust in traditional institutions is in decline and relations between countries has been under strain. Stéphane, we thank you for your work and also for your presence with us today. Over 130 individuals registered for this webinar, and many others expressed an interest in attending but couldn't do so during their workday. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted soon on all 3 of our organization's websites. With this brief introduction, I will now turn the microphone over to Mark Ritchie, President of Global Minnesota. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome, Stéphane, again. When you were here a year ago, we had a chance to celebrate. We had artifacts from our Historical Society of Minnesota's crucial role in the founding of the UN. We talked about a lot of parts of the future for the UN, but none of us could have imagined how this year will have brought to the forefront many of the different kinds of agencies and other parts of the UN that we now can see are crucial to our survival, crucial to our well-being. In fact, just last week in Minnesota, we celebrated World Food Day, which was the 75th anniversary of the founding by the UN of the Food and Agriculture Organization. It was the first specialized organization created by the UN to deal with the famine that had really swept across Europe, Asia. That whole Second World War period had caused, through the civil conflict and the military conflict, famine and hunger throughout the world. And it was such an important event and such an important thing we celebrated each year. But we also celebrated that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, who has honored the UN Secretary General, and many of the UN specialized agencies and organizations over the years, chose this year to honor the World Food Program for their work in being the 911 from the planet, where it was Beirut with a gigantic explosion that ruined 85% of the nation's flour, the most important food, or responding to the need for protective equipment for people dealing with the COVID around the planet, or the need to get people move from one place to the other for specialized care. So we've had a chance this last year to really see the UN in action in every part of the life of the planet and how important it is. So today, to welcome you back is an opportunity for us to say thank you again to the UN for that kind of role on our planet, but also to promise you, to pledge to you our continued energy, our continued focus, our continued devotion on making the next 75 years of the UN as dynamic, as important, as crucial, and also to have it be in the embrace of a whole planet that sees the logic, which is when we can find ways to avoid war, to promote peace, we can find ways to deal with hunger and health. But we also have to remember that we have to deal with those day-to-day crises of health and human rights, gender equity and racial equity as a part of creating the conditions for peace. The UN inspires us, and having you back to help us close out this year is such an important and honor to us. Thank you again. I want to hand it over to Stu Ackman, President of our Harold Stassen chapter of the United Nations Association of America.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. I'm very glad you could be here. On behalf of the United Nations Association, I welcome you. It was a great human achievement that 75 years ago, the United Nations was created. There was a lesson as part of that. When the League of Nations failed and World War I proceeded, there was a sense that something needed to change, and it did. And so we have the United Nations 75 years later. Today we celebrate the work of the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Mark just highlighted the World Food Program. Global Minnesota did a fabulous day-long program last week. Of course, there's the World Health Organization, which is working hand in hand with the World Food Program, which is charged with mitigating the impacts and eventually eliminating COVID and keeping track of other infectious diseases, including polio, malaria, and Ebola. And one of the things that we must not lose track of is UN peacekeeping. Approximately 100,000 individuals, 86,000 of which are military soldiers, 13,000 civilians, and 1,300 volunteers are currently deployed in 13 operations, some of which are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kosovo, Cyprus, South Sudan, and there's an observer group in India and Pakistan. At this time, we'll play the UN Day message from Secretary-General António Guterres.
Today, we face a global pandemic, and worldwide, people rightly raise their voices against racism. Confronting problems is a start, but we also have to solve them. We have a timeless guide to tackle our shared challenges and fix the world's fragilities. The guide is the United Nations Charter. The Charter was signed 75 years ago, and its principles ring just as true today. Facing fundamental human rights, the equal rights of men and women, the dignity and worth of every person, international law and the peaceful settlement of disputes, better standards of life in larger freedom. These enduring values will carry us to a new future. A future where we stop harming the natural environment and start tackling climate change. Where we reject bigotry and celebrate the richness of human diversity. Where young people lead in the streets, in their schools, in society. The United Nations was founded before threats like cybercrime and online hate speech emerged. But our charter shows how to rise to these challenges too. Let us realize this vision of peace, human rights, and justice for everyone by joining together with humanity, with unity, with each other.
As we all know, the UN covers an enormous amount of ground. The individual responsible for articulating this on behalf of Secretary António Guterres, Secretary-General António Guterres, is Stephane Dujarric. Last year, we learned that he heads a team of 10 individuals and that he starts every day at 5:45 in the morning reading and preparing to present and frame the most important issues of the day. And eventually, at a press conference, to answer a wide variety of questions from the from the press corps, all with the necessity of clarity and precision so as to not be misunderstood and cause a problem. Stephane was appointed spokesperson for the Secretary General in 2014 by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He served in the same position for Secretary General Kofi Annan from 2005 to 2006. And of course, we consider Kofi practically a native son of Minnesota. Prior to joining the United Nations in 2000, Mr. Dujarric worked for ABC News Television for almost 10 years in various capacities in the network's New York City, London, and Paris news bureaus. He traveled extensively on assignment to cover major stories throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Born in France, Mr. Dujarric has lived in the United States for most of the last 40 years. He is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He is married, lives in New York City, has 3 children, 1 in university, 1 in high school, and a 3rd in middle school. So Steph is a Mets fan, which puts him roughly on the same ground as Minnesota sports, sort of disappointed unless one's got one's expectations in line. And with that, we welcome Stéphane Dujarric.
There we go. So I just want to say a big thank you to Nancy, to Stu, to Mark for welcoming back virtually to Minnesota. As I mentioned, you guys got me on the cheap today. I'm sitting in my office in between 2 meetings. So if I seem a bit more distracted than I did last year, I do apologize. And I really wish I could be with you in person. As Nancy mentioned, we had a great visit last year to the Twin Cities. I was very impressed and moved by the students that I met, by all the UNA members, the Global Minnesota members, the members of the Citizens for Global Solutions that evening, and just really very touched by the welcome and the hospitality shown by all of you. So it's it's really an honor to be able to talk to this joint group of UNA USA, Global Minnesota, Citizens for Global Solutions. I think 3 fantastic organizations that work in the spirit of Minnesotan leaders who came before us, and fought hard to create the United Nations, to sustain the United Nations, and the principles for which this organization stands for. So, the challenge that I face by speaking to the same group 2 years in a row is that I can't rehash the same remarks. I can't use the same speech. I can't use the same jokes. So I had to work on some new material, which made me work a little bit harder. Though, we don't have to be, none of us have to be experts in international relations to realize that October 2020 looks a whole lot different than October 2019. And I think very few of us could have predicted that we would find ourselves in the world, in the situation that we live in. So, given that this is virtual, I want to give more time to taking questions from all of you who have tuned in. But before we go to questions, I just want to say a few words about the UN in the time of COVID, the challenges that we see from UN headquarters on how we keep the UN running. So I basically want to touch on three broad areas: the multilateral system, the role of the Secretary General at this time, and finally the staff of the UN and how the organization is working. So, as the old saying goes, may you live in interesting times. I think that has been delivered on us many times over. It's plain to see, if you look at the multilateral system, that if there was ever a time that we needed a strong, functioning multilateral institutions to face challenges that really don't care and don't respect international borders, it would be now. Sadly, I think one of the underlying problems that we are facing with COVID-19 is that early on in this crisis, too many countries went their own ways in dealing with the crisis instead of trying to face it in a truly coordinated way, which I think this coordination could have saved a lot of suffering straight on. And we are seeing, I mean, if you look just at the lack of coordination on border policies in any parts of the world, the European Union and other parts of the world, you could see that there is a real lack of global coordination. But we will need this coordination moving forward on figuring out how we come out of this crisis and the kind of post-COVID world and what it will look like. So very soon after the crisis erupted, my boss, Secretary-General António Guterres, made a call for a global ceasefire. As he put it, as long as humans keep fighting other humans, whether it's in Yemen, in Libya, in Colombia, in Syria, or any other place, the only winner is the virus. And no place right now illustrates that challenge more than what is going on in the Armenia-Azerbaijan area. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen COVID cases go up 80% in Azerbaijan and have gone up almost by half in Armenia. So, you know, it's really the case in point of why we need this global ceasefire today more than ever. The ceasefire, I think the ceasefire call struck a chord with the global community. It was quickly endorsed by 114 governments, many different regional organizations, religious leaders. The Pope endorsed it, civil society groups, a number of armed groups endorsed it. And, you know, the Secretary General is a very practical man. He fully understands that, you know, that mistrust remains high and it's difficult to move from this kind of global call towards implementation, but his envoys on the ground are working hard at it. And we're seeing some progress. You know, there are some bright spots. There are talks going on right now in Geneva and Libya, on Libya. In Syria, the ceasefire is mostly held and nothing has gone backwards. In Yemen, there's some fighting, but there's also, we've seen a release exchange of prisoners. In Afghanistan, while there is violence, remains violence in Afghanistan, at least the government and the Taliban are talking. So we're seeing some positive trends. So, you know, as I said, we received a lot of support from the globe for this global ceasefire, but one voice I think was missing for a long time, and that's the voice of the Security Council, the unified voice of the Security Council, the UN organ tasked with the maintenance of peace and security in the world. And it took months for members of the Security Council to agree on a text, and they did. And, you know, one that could have been stronger, but it was clear. Now, the reason I think it took so long was not that because member states were by definition against a ceasefire. Nobody can be against a ceasefire, but it's really because of the dysfunctional level of bilateral relations between the main powers, the tensions we're seeing between the main powers, and how the bilateral bleeds into the multilateral. So, you know, the UN, the Security Council, General Assembly doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so what happens outside has a direct impact on what happens inside the UN's legislative body. But that lack of unity from member states and the Security Council, I think, didn't stop the Secretary General for one moment. And he moved forward first on instructing his envoys, but also, and this brings me to my second point, is that the fact that member states that make up the organization, this is a member state-based organization, didn't succeed in truly uniting and unleashing, did not, my sense is that it created more pressure on the Secretary General to step in. And step in, I think he did. Not surprisingly, COVID is impacting every one of the UN's mandates, from the political, from the humanitarian, peacekeeping, human rights, refugees, just to name a few. And his voice, the voice of the Secretary General, I think has been very clear in calling for solidarity, in calling for unity, in calling for hope, but also issuing a strong warning about the post-COVID world, and one that we hope will not make the inequalities that COVID has laid bare any worse, and making sure that the development gains of the last decade in the fight against poverty, in the fight for women's rights, in the fight for children and access to healthcare are not erased. And that is a very, very big risk, especially on poverty-related indicators. We're already seeing a downward trend in a lot of countries. On a political level, I mentioned he has appealed for a global ceasefire, and on the vaccine, he's also been very vocal on the need for the vaccine and therapeutics to fight the virus, that they need to be treated as a global public good. We are concerned, again, at the lack of international cooperation on this issue, though we're seeing positive movement in terms of the COVAX facility, the WHO efforts. But our fear is that the vaccine will be available unequally, that only the rich countries will get it, and even within the wealthier countries, there will be inequalities, that only the wealthy and the poorest countries will have access to it. So treating it as a global public good is not only morally right, which we believe it is, and I hope you do as well, but it is also in everyone's self-interest that treatment is accessible to all. I mean, if ever there was a truth to the saying, none of us are safe until all of us are safe, it is with the vaccine and the virus, because it needs to be stamped out everywhere. We also launched a global humanitarian response plan to raise funds for the most vulnerable populations, including refugees and internally displaced people, populations that were already vulnerable. The UN's global supply chain system was put at the disposal of developing countries. In many parts of Africa, during the height of the lockdown, UN planes were the only ones flying in millions of test kits, regulators, surgical masks, humanitarian workers. We've reached over 100 countries in that way. Our peacekeeping operations, our political missions have adapted to new ways of working under these new conditions and have been supporting national authorities in the fight against the virus, in addition to the other critical functions that they are mandated to perform. We've also issued a global plan for a post-COVID recovery with a series of reports and policy briefs to provide analysis and advice for an effective coordinated response by the international community. Our local teams, we have UN offices in about 160 countries and territories, are working with local officials and governments to help put these policies in place and support the governments in any way we can. And lastly, I'll come to the staff before I take your questions. We are an organization of bureaucrats. We're an organization of field workers, of humanitarian workers, of peacekeepers. So the lockdown, like any organization, has created tremendous challenges for us. But under following the leadership of the Secretary General, we've kept the UN running from kitchen tables around the world for those of us who work at headquarters. The impact has been very hard on our peacekeeping colleagues, our humanitarian colleagues who are in the field, because rotations had to be stopped for months at a time. So people found themselves who were used to being separated from their families, separated even even longer. In New York, the Secretary General took the decision to close down the UN headquarters very early on, in kind of early to mid-March, about 10 days before the city itself shut down Broadway, sports events, museums, etc. And he did it, I would say, for a number of reasons. First, out of an abundance of caution, because we needed to be good neighbors, but also you could say for political reasons, because we could not afford the UN becoming a hotspot within the hotspot that New York was fast becoming at that time. So overnight, we went from about 11,000 people going into the building, the compound every day, and that includes visitors and diplomats, journalists and staff, to now to about 100 or so during the lockdown. And now we're slowly opening up very carefully. We have about 11 to 1,400 people that come in every day. So like all organizations, we're working virtually, helping member states hold meetings virtually, making our humanitarian peacekeeping colleagues in the field, making sure they are well served and supported from headquarters. And of course, this year is the 75th anniversary. We should have had a great General Assembly, commemoration of the work done, looking hard at the future of the UN we want. But we wound up having a very different General Assembly, one that was hybrid. The Secretary General, the President of General Assembly spoke in person in the hall. About 200 people were in the hall, and that's in comparison to about 2,500 who were in the hall on the first day of the General Assembly. Usually, every country was allowed to have one representative per delegation at the seat, and world leaders spoke via pre-recorded messages, videos. Some were short and to the point, and others not so short, but also obviously to the point. On the plus side, we had more heads of states and governments than ever before addressing the General Assembly. The big loss was, of course, the personal touch, the informal diplomacy that takes place every year on the sideline of General Assembly, when world leaders get to have discreet conversations to either kickstart difficult negotiations, to wrap up difficult negotiations, to just be able to speak to each other, not under the pressure of journalists or the glare of the lights. It was also, frankly, a big loss for our host city. I mean, yes, everybody joked about no traffic, but the city took a huge economic blow by not having the tens of thousands of people who descend on the UN for the General Assembly week. So it hit hotels, restaurants, stores, car services, caterers, you name it. There was a lot, and it was very sad, I think, for the city that we all call home. So the Secretary General is continuing his duties. He's working the phone, like all of us, getting on Zoom calls, even meeting some people in person. He's continuing to do interviews. We just sat down for a big interview with the Associated Press. You should see that out probably in the next day or so. Most importantly, his focus is to keep the world's attention on the most important task, beating back the virus and building back a stronger, greener world. And I think that leads me also just to mention one more thing, and that's climate change. I think the big focus next year will be on getting to zero emissions by 2050. As the Secretary General says, COVID is the fundamental crisis of the year. Climate change is a fundamental crisis of the century. And looking back, even though we're not out of the crisis, at the way we're dealing COVID, the world as a whole hasn't done a great job in working in a coordinated way. And we need to do much, much better when it comes to climate change. So I will leave it there. I look forward to taking your questions, and thank you very much.
Steph, as you might expect, there's a robust bunch of questions coming in, as well as in the chat and some Q&A in the Q&A box. One of the first questions that came in had to do, it was the world cannot sustain a population of 9 billion. What are, if there are, any new initiatives that are being planned by the UN to encourage, I'd say, family planning and Planned Parenthood? Are there any connections that the UN has that way?
Well, the UN agency in charge is UNFPA, the UN Fund for Population, and it's really basically to ensure that women everywhere have control over their reproductive rights, have access to health care, have their babies have access to health care. And one of the many negative impacts of COVID has been on women, their ability to access health care, the ability, the rise, we're seeing a very dangerous and concerning rise of violence, gender-based violence against women during the lockdown. It's something the Secretary-General flagged very early on. So, I would encourage people who are interested in knowing more to go to the UNFPA website, who can tell you exactly what they're doing and where and in which countries.
Thank you. A question, what are the steps the UN under Secretary Guterres' leadership or planning to take to unite the nations of the world against COVID-19?
Well,
and then what do you think COVID-19 aftermath will look like? Will we look better off as a world when it all finishes and settles down? Will we have come together, or will it just be treacherous?
Well, we're an optimistic and realistic bunch here. We are working hard to make sure that we come out of this stronger, that we come out of this greener, in a sense, that the investments in the community, we're seeing a lot of countries, rich and less rich, put out stimulus packages. It's important that those packages also focus on building back a green economy, not invest in fossil fuel, but invest in renewable energy. That, we're looking at promoting what the Secretary-General broadly calls a new social contract to ensure that there is more equity in the world in terms of access to basic services, to ensuring human rights. So, the Secretary-General is not, as you well know, the world president who can impose his will. That's not the United Nations that we have. It's not the United Nations we want, frankly. But he is there to remind member states who've all signed on, but when becoming member states, signed on to the ideals of the Charter, to remember those ideals as they move forward. So his is more trying to keep his flock together in a way, and he regularly brings them around the table to discuss not only COVID, but especially what the post-COVID world will need and the investments that the post-COVID world will need.
Thank you. A couple of questions here, sort of interrelated. Well, most Americans are familiar with the bulky attitude of our own government over the past few years towards international law and institutions. It's fair to say that some of the other permanent 5 members have been behaving with high-handed disregard for the UN Charter on political conflicts and profound indifference to global dangers like climate and nuclear weapons. Assume for a moment a correction in US attitudes, say more like the Obama administration. How do you see the UN system becoming more able to forge agreement on concerted action to deal with pressing issues with these other when these other partners are not likely to change their leadership cadre anytime soon?
Look, it's hard for me to have to predict the future, and it's not my role to get into politics. What is a fact is that there has been, over a number of years, and not, you look back 10 years or so, challenges to the multilateral system and the commitment of the most powerful member states to that multilateral system. And that is a challenge, right? And the Secretary-General, his job is to kind of remind those member states all of them, of the importance of the multilateral system, not for the sake of just because we want the UN to work, but if we're going to get out of the COVID mess, if we're going to get out of the climate change mess, if we're going to move forward on disarmament, it can only be done in a multilateral setting. So his job is to make sure that the UN works, right? That the system delivers. And he has to encourage member states. And again, his job is not to dictate, but his job is to encourage and to use his bully pulpit to ensure that the multilateral system is strengthened.
Thank you. Another question, of all the initiatives you've designed to fight the pandemic, let's see, initiatives you've seen designed to fight the pandemic of personal and organizational corruption. So this is around corruption and how you work through it in the delivery of, say, COVID aid and getting the world together for collective response. There was another one that kind of included Haiti in that bit of thought process too. The corruption is hampering or not helping the situation. Are you seeing corruption with the delivery?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, you know, for the Secretary General, it's pretty clear that corruption is, how did he put it, the ultimate betrayal of the public trust. And we have seen worrying signs of corruption impacting the way funds are diverted that are meant to fight COVID. You know, whenever you have an increase of funds into a system, whether it's stimulus, whether it's humanitarian aid, there's always a risk of corruption. Corruption undermines good governance. It puts us further off track in reaching the sustainable development goals. But, you know, and we've seen cases of with COVID about, you know, people selling below standard equipment, masks, and all of that. So that's, you know, defective equipment, medicine that was completely ineffective. The other big part of, you know, and people think of corruption as just kind of payoffs or theft. The other big part of it is illicit flows of cash, tax havens, right? That takes tax revenues away from countries that need it. So there's a lot of work to be done on many levels.
A question from one of our from a student. I think in this case a college student, Steph.
Mm-hmm.
How may we as students support UN efforts on a local basis?
Well, you know, one way is, you know, obviously to join, you know, the organizations like the ones who all of you were sponsoring this talk. But I would think, you know, working with civic organizations, whether it's the Lions or the Rotary, community-based organizations, you're doing what we're trying to do globally at a local level, right? I mean, the UN, I mean, this is a phrase that's too often used, but it is our United Nations, right? These goals aren't, the principles in the charter aren't the principles of just some people. They're the principle of all the peoples from all the member states who have joined the organization. And our focus is on achieving these ideals, on achieving the sustainable development goals at the global level, but none of that can be achieved at the global level unless people like the student, I don't know his or her name, gets involved locally, right? I mean, if you work on issues on housing, on issues of, you know, women's rights, children's rights, access to healthcare, access to education, that's all part of the global challenge that we are working towards as well.
Thank you. Let's see, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Has Secretary-General Guterres reached out, excuse my not knowing how to pronounce this, to Keiji Fukuda to help with the SARS-CoV-2? WHO had Fukuda go to West Africa to squelch Ebola. Then China used him to help with SARS-2. Can he be asked to help with the US?
Honestly, that I don't know.
Okay.
I think that's a question to be asked of the World Health Organization, but I apologize. I really don't know.
Okay. Can you comment on the Chinese COVID vaccine and their initiative to make it available to poor countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America?
From our standpoint, two principles that really apply to anyone who's developing vaccines is that one, we would want to see them, treated as a global public good, go through all the necessary tests. But that's really also that's more in the scientific realm of the World Health Organization. But it is important that member states participate and support the WHO's COVAX initiative to ensure that the vaccine is shared, or that member states, especially the least wealthiest ones, have access to cash in order to buy the vaccine.
Steph, on a more general note, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Part of it is when I'm privileged to go to the field in the days when we used to travel with the Secretary General, and I see my colleagues, my UN colleagues who are in the field, far from home, often when they're international staff, really giving 150% of themselves trying to build a better world. I mean, one of the most amazing young people I met was in northern Uganda. We were there with the Secretary General 2.5 years ago, I think. We were visiting a UNHCR refugee camp for refugees coming in from South Sudan into northern Uganda. And I met a young man who was Syrian, working for the refugee agency from Aleppo. And this was a time when Aleppo was being bombarded and bombed and torn apart. And here was this young man, thousands and thousands of miles from home, from a country itself being torn. And what was he doing? He was someplace else in the world trying to help people. And when I see my colleagues, when I see the local humanitarian workers, the local NGOs, all these people really working earnestly with goodwill, it shows me the best of humankind, and gives and gives me hope. And that's why it's so important for those of us who work at the UN in this glass tower to step out and walk away a bit from the politics, the multilateral politics, and see the world as it is.
Would you fill in more about the Sahel Conference that you talked about with the media today? It was a big success.
We hosted with the European Union a conference for the Sahel. The Sahel is probably the fastest growing humanitarian crisis in the world. And we had a conference on the Central Sahel, which is basically Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And they are suffering from a host of issues, obviously COVID, issues of violence extremism, of terrorism, often some of it linked to, was increased after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. That's so an influx of weapons and arms. We've seen fighters come from the Middle East to join that. Climate change, where extreme weather, floods and droughts impacting people's ability to grow their own food, and the climate change also creating a clash between the pastoralists and the farmers, right? And you've got traditional herders who have moved across borders, across boundaries with their cattle, being forced because of climate change, because of desertification, further south in lands that are really used for farming. So that has created a lot of challenges. Sadly, this is one of the most undercovered crises in the world because of its remoteness from the Western world. But it is one of these multifaceted crises that the UN has to deal with.
The UN has changed substantially from its inception, where it was dealing with the end of empires, to the rise of states, to the importance of individuals even, cities, NGOs. How is the UN changing to meet the new dynamics in the world where there wants to be much more NGO and citizen participation?
I mean, the world today is not the world of 1945, right? I mean, we had 50 member states at the beginning, we have 193. What was initially more of a talk shop has become a much more operational organization. I mean, peacekeeping was not envisaged in the charter, and something that was created out of thin air, led by a tremendous American diplomat, Ralph Bunche. And so the UN, I mean, you know, the UN, to put it simply, is a reflection of the world we live in. And so we talk about UN reform, but it's really about UN adaptation. We need to make sure the system fits the world that in which we operate. One of the big changes, as you mentioned, Stu, is the fact that the UN now is and needs to even open up more. And that's what part of what the Secretary-General calls the new multilateralism, the new global system, is to ensure that civil society, youth groups, the business sector, all these other groups have more of a say in the UN. And that's been a process, I would say, that that started, you know, in earnest under Kofi Annan, with a very focused opening to the private sector. And that has continued exponentially through the other two secretaries general. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a kind of built-in tension between that and some member states who feel that the organization, as defined by the Charter, is an organization of member states. So that's a reality we have to live with. But we can't help being more open to these non-member state sectors, because if you look at the world around you, where is the power? Now, the government, central governments retain a huge amount of the power, right? I mean, on the use of force, just to use one example. But if you look at certain foundations, if you use certain businesses, global businesses, they have a tremendous amount of money, a tremendous ability to influence economies, to influence societies. So we need to make sure that the UN as a convening platform is open to all these entities. And we've seen it in discussions about the internet, where it's kind of what we call this clunky world. It's kind of multi-stakeholder platforms, where it's not just government, but it's also industries and civil society groups that have a way to speak and to influence.
Perfect. Okay, a question. At the World Food Day conference, the head of the World Food Program, Beasley, stated that they needed to raise another $4 billion. They only have $8 billion and they need $12 billion to handle the doubling of people needing food aid. Is there an organized effort to raise that funding?
Well, first of all, I'd say I think we have to congratulate our colleagues at WFP for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And frankly, David Beasley is a tremendous UN leader. And I think on a personal note, I think he's done a fantastic job in raising the profile of WFP and ensuring that the funding for WFP continues. If you've seen or heard him recently, he's been pretty blunt It's like, you know, there are billionaires in this world that need to cough up some money. As he put it, I'm not against anybody making money, but they are a number of people who were very wealthy before COVID, who have become even wealthier. And it's about encouraging them to also give money. And I would, you know, I would not want to be sitting across the table from David Beasley because he's a very persuasive guy. So he may squeeze a few dollars out of me, but he will. This is a fight that he will continue to take.
So let's just drill down on that. So let's say that, what would Beasley say to somebody? How would he convince a billionaire to make a contribution like that? Would it be on a spiritual basis, philosophical, better for the world, better for himself? How does that work?
It's like everything. I mean, I don't know what arguments he would use, but the arguments that I would use, it's like, and it's kind of like what I said about the vaccine. It's not only the right and moral thing to do, it's in your self-interest, right? Peace, stability, equity is in the self-interest of the business community. That's how they make money, right? It's hard. I mean, you know, you've always got people who profit from wars, but in general, most businesses will be healthier if the world is healthier, if the world is more peaceful. So you could use the moral argument, or you could just use a self-interest argument. Frankly, as long as the results are the same, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, so let's see. We're coming close to the end of the time here. We're not quite there. There's so many questions. You know, one of the things that always comes up is, I don't know if there's an answer that's possible about the Security Council, reform of the Security Council, and where does that go? What are the dynamics there?
We know we'd like it to go. The dynamics are that it's a tough nut to crack, and I will put it in kind of a different. 2 points I want to make. One, it's critical to the centrality of the legitimacy of the UN to have a Security Council that reflects the world that we live in today, not the world of 1945. That's pretty clear. Second, how we get there, when we get there, what it looks like, is firmly in the hands of member states. They will decide. The Secretary-General doesn't have any authority or any say in that. It's up to the member states. It will likely call for a review of the charter and a ratification by member states of the charter. So it's a long and complicated process. So those are two facts. My opinion, it's my personal opinion, is that I'm not too optimistic. And I would say because those who have the power can kind of sit pretty because those who want in have yet to agree and really agree on a unified plan. And by that, I mean, there's so much competition from those who want to get into the council in either a permanent or semi-permanent way, that until there's unity from those who want to go in, I think those who are in will probably have some more time to themselves.
So going back to the operations of the UN today, so you have some staffing coming. Are there visitors being accepted
No,
today?
there are no visitors in the building. There are very few member state meetings, very few travel, if any. I mean, the Secretary General, you know, and let me just put it this way: we are very aware of the need for us to respect the health regulation of our host city and our host state. So the Secretary General has left the country twice since March, really to go home to visit his family. His wife is the deputy mayor of Lisbon, so she's been staying in Lisbon, and his mother is in her upper 90s, so he went home. Every time he came back, and he did 2 weeks quarantine back here in New York at the residence and worked from home. So we are being good neighbors. We are being very careful. We are being safe, which means that the building right now remains closed to visitors.
One last question, I think, Steph. Do you have any favorite positive examples of the work that the UN is doing that we could cite? We were approached by family or friends who are critical of the UN system.
Well, two points to make. One is, I think the first, when somebody says that to you, you should be somewhat Talmudic and answer with a question. Like, what UN are you talking about? And the challenge that we have, and I think I may have made that point last year, is that we have on one hand the world's most recognizable logo, yet no brand management by design. So many people can speak and act on behalf of the UN. So when the Security Council fails to unite, when the General Assembly is in disarray, it's the UN. And when legislative bodies of the UN pass resolutions that may be an affront to the person you're speaking to, you could say, well, that's the member states, right? Those are sovereign member states. But you have to point to the millions of people that are being fed by the World Food Program every day. The refugees that are being given housing and shelter by the UN Refugee Agency, the amazing work that the World Health Organization has done in partnership with organizations like Rotary in almost wiping out polio. You talk to them about the UNICEF staff members who are going out and vaccinating children against polio in war zones, right? That's also the work of the United Nations. That's the stuff that United Nations staff members do day in and day out.
Thank you. We have a robust chat and questions and answers going on. We'll be sure to share these with you, Steph. And just wonderful presentation today. We have a few closing remarks from Nancy Dunleavy and Mark Ritchie. And if you'll hang on and maybe add a little parting word at the end, we would appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Thank you very, very much. So,
Stu, I think we have about 5 more minutes for Q&A.
okay, would you like to pose a question?
I haven't been following the chat.
Okay, Mark, would you like to pose a question?
So 25 years ago, organizations in Minnesota and in partnership around the country convened a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the UN with the surviving founders out in the Opera House in San Francisco. It was incredible. We had a chance to think about many different things. But what I reflected on in preparing for today and thinking about today is that those were the last moments of so many of the founders, Minnesota Governor Harold Stassen and others. We've come to the end nearly of the lives of the survivors of the Holocaust, of the Second World War, of the Second World War veterans, the passing of the baton of the generations who fought the wars, who dealt with the genocide and the tragedies, who then built the UN system and the World Health. That generation is now passing the baton in more or less its final decade. And so, Stephane, you are part of a whole group of people, and I like to think of our Minnesota community as part of that, who must pick up that torch to light the way, must grab that baton of the task that's unfinished and run with it. Do you feel like the young people that are coming behind us are going to just push us out of the way and take the baton and take the torch and just move us and we can get moving with them? How do you see this youth movement that globally is challenging the most repressive regimes, the craziness of gun violence, the question of climate? It just feels like there's something going on. There's huge generational change, and you must be able to see it from your position there at the UN.
Well, frankly, I wouldn't mind if they did push us out of the way. I think as the Secretary General said a number of times, our generation, his generation, I'm 15 years younger than him, so I don't know if we're in the same generation, but it's not as if we've really succeeded, right? There's a lot of arguments to be made that we failed the youth in terms of how we're leaving the planet to them, right? In terms of the conflicts, in terms of the climate. It is clear that without the push of young people, governments would not be moving on climate change like they are. It is clear that the youth have also understood the power of the purse, which has also pushed the business community. So the power, the savvy, and the political engagement of young people in the world today, I think, give me hope.
Great. Thank you, Steph. This was terrific. Nancy, do you want to take the mic?
This was really wonderful. And I think while we're all isolated in our own homes, to talk with you, Stephane, and to have all the wonderful questions coming in from everyone, and you only were able to just touch on the beginnings of them, makes me feel like we're really part of one world and, trying to work together here to make some kind of difference. So thank you so much. I just want to give a little bit of an explanation to those who don't know about Citizens for Global Solutions of Minnesota, one of the 3 partner organizations for this event. We have existed since 1946, originally as the World Federalist Association. And we make a point of staying informed about and engaged with various global problems, and we strive to offer global solutions that we as Minnesotans can engage in locally. In the Twin Cities here, we're most well known for our 3rd Thursday Global Issues Forums program, which ran from 2000 all the way up until very recently. And now we've sort of tweaked that a bit. We're now starting a 3rd Thursday Global Films discussion group. So each month we're choosing a film that we watch on our own, and then we're gathering together to have a discussion about it. This last month, we started this new program, and we actually studied Prosecuting Evil, the Extraordinary World of Ben Ferencz. I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with Ben Ferencz, who's the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials. He's now 100 years old this year, and also a leading advocate for the creation of the International Criminal Court. So check our website. We'll be listing very soon our November film, and that'll be an ongoing program. We also participate in CGS National's World Citizens Virtual Book Club, which is where we read the book and then discuss together. And right now that group is over 3 months covering the book, My Country is the World, The Adventures of a World Citizen by Gary Davis. So to find out about these activities and various other events and campaigns that we're doing, as we are all virtual right now, please go to our website, which is globalsolutionsmn.org. That's globalsolutionsmn.org. And I will now turn the program over to Mark Ritchie, and who's going to share with us a bit about the programs in Global Minnesota.
Well, I'll just respond to one of the questions, which was, where could this person who was asking find more about the UN 75th? We have people who were on today from Kentucky and around the world, different places of the country, and I think that's a shared question. On the Global Minnesota website and the Global Minnesota YouTube channel, you can find a wide range of different things about the UN, including last year and this year, new programs about UN agencies like the All-Day World Food Day from last Friday. But also the UN itself has incredible media materials, not only on the history and the life of the UN, but also on the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of the kind of grassroots participation of so many groups here in Minnesota and others going forward. So Global Minnesota is active on things, everything from the history to the future, but also on the programs of the UN, like the World Food Program or the Sustainable Development Goals. So our website, the YouTube, all of those are places where you can find out more about that. Stephane, thank you for being there and for representing the best, the highest ideals of those who founded and created the UN, of those who've sustained it, of our friend, our sort of adopted Minnesotan, Kofi Annan, and others that you've had the good fortune and the gift of being able to work with closely. And also, we want you to come back again when it's safe. And someday, we would like to make sure that you come out with the Secretary General so we could have a really fun opportunity back when we're safe, can really celebrate. And for us, this could be something that we could all look forward to and make happen when it becomes safe again. Thank you.
Great. Listen, thank you, Mark, and thank you to Stu for moderating. Thank you for Nancy. I just want to say that, you know, I think as I said in one of the answers to the student, you know, what you do at the local level has a huge impact and is critical to the work we do at the global level. And that critical link between the global and the local is really about the first words of the charter, we the peoples. And so I would encourage you to stay engaged in your communities, business, civil society, academia, whatever you want to do. But to put it simply, I think your work is all about understanding the relevance of the United Nations, of our United Nations. So thank you again for having me, and I hope to see all of you in person very soon.
Steph, we're not quite finished yet. You know, there was a nice little note in here that said Cargill just matched the $1 million Nobel Peace Prize award to the World Food Program. So that's a great thing. And follow on, should we encourage other matches here locally? And I think that's a great idea too. And I would also say this is in no small part due to Global Minnesota and Mark Ritchie's robust program that you did last week, or Global Minnesota, all of the Global Minnesota folks. We also have background here, Carolina Gustafson and Tim Odegaard from Global Minnesota, who've been kind of running the background piece of this webinar, and very much thank them. And so just a note about the United Nations Association of Minnesota. We're formed as a nonprofit organization to promote the goals and principles of the United Nations. We're a chapter of the UNA USA, the national organization, and our parent organization is the UN Foundation. We all work cooperatively together. We're focused on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Our next program is on Sustainable Development Goal number 14. It's Life Underwater, which is the goal, and it will be a virtual program with Dr. Luther Adland, who's a river scientist with the River Ecology Unit of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. He'll discuss issues related to the global loss of freshwater biodiversity and efforts in Minnesota and beyond, including East Coast and other places, to restore the health of river systems. You can sign up on our webpage. It's under the Events and Meetings tab. I've seen a little bit of his presentation, or quite a lot. It's just dramatic what happens when you remove dams or take silt out of streams and make them flow normally again. We have, since 2004, educated or had 25,000 or more middle and senior high school students participate in Model UN. Our Model UN conference is coming up on November 20th. It'll be virtual. We expect 300 students from half a dozen high schools. We focus, aside from these two programs, we focus on advocacy for the UN. Last thing, I would be remiss if I didn't say, we're a membership organization. Dues are not so much. And if you're less than 26, they're free. We invite you to join, and you can find that under our webpage at the Get Involved tab. So that's the program today. Steph, we really appreciate it. I know you're a busy, busy guy, and thanks for taking the time to do this. And as Mark said, we hope to see you soon again in person.
Thank you. So I'm sorry I jumped the closing words, but I think I've already closed. So no, thank you again, Stu, and thank you to all of you who took part of your day to listen in and to watch and ask questions. Thank you.